At the center of the hall stood the alloy pillar, a block of metal so strong no blade had ever pierced it. For centuries, it had been the Academy's trial. Prove your strength against the unbreakable. One by one, the cadets lined up, each carrying a weapon meant to show the pride of their species. Plasma swords hissed with heat, crystal axes glimmered like frozen lightning, alloy hammers sparked with caged power. Every strike slammed against the pillar with showers of sparks, and every strike failed. The metal stood flawless, unmoved. The human waited at the end of the line. When his turn came, he stepped forward with nothing but a wooden spear. Smooth, fire-darkened, sharpened by hand. The hall erupted in laughter. "Fragile," someone shouted. "One hit and it'll snap," another sneered. Did he carve that in the dormitory? The instructors did not intervene. They watched, neutral, their expressions unreadable. "All weapons will be tested equally," one of them said calmly. That only fueled the mockery. The human's name was David Carter. He wore no visible augmentations, no armor enhancements. His gait was steady but unremarkable. His posture relaxed, almost too casual for the ceremonial tone of the trial. And still, he moved toward the pillar without hesitation. The room dimmed slightly as the shielding field adjusted for the next impact test. The surface of the alloy gleamed under the overhead lights, untouched by the last 20 strikes. David set the tip of the wooden spear against the base of the pillar. No flourish, no stance, just a measured breath and a tightening of the grip. He drove the spear forward in a clean, snapping thrust. The sound was not the crack of breaking wood, it was thunder. The impact sent a concussive wave through the floor. Cadets flinched, one staggered backward into the wall. The pillar groaned, and a long, jagged fracture split across its surface, zigzagging up from the point of impact like lightning across a storm-dark sky. The wooden spear pulled back whole, unbroken. The fire-hardened point was scorched black, but intact. The alloy, the metal that no blade had ever marred, bore the mark of a single human strike. The laughter died instantly. For a long moment, no one moved. A crystalline cadet stepped forward cautiously, touching the crack with one long-fingered hand. "It's real," she said, her voice small. Another cadet ran a sensor wand along the split. The screen flashed with structural failure alerts. "Internal fracture depth, 11.2 centimeters," he said in disbelief. "But that's not possible. That metal is rated to deflect orbital impact." The instructors exchanged glances. David stepped back, resetting the spear across his shoulders. He didn't speak. One of the Drex cadets, bulkier than most, eyes like burning coals, stomped forward. "What's the trick? Is it laced with plasma? Hidden vibrational core? Tell us what's in the shaft." David turned, voice even. "Wood." Laughter didn't return this time. An instructor raised a hand. "You'll surrender the weapon for analysis." David nodded once and handed it over. The lab techs carried it to the diagnostics chamber, placing it on a scanner cradle. Cadets crowded around the observation screen, watching the data crawl across the display. "Organic material," one of the med techs read aloud. "Hardwood, unreinforced, carbonized tip, standard fire hardening pattern, no alloy, no internal components, no synthetic threading." Another zoomed in on the spearhead. It wasn't even carved with machine tools. This was hand-shaped, probably with a knife. Silence fell again. Then, quietly, the question that had been waiting behind every glance. If the weapon wasn't special, what was? David was taken to the medical wing immediately after. Not because he was injured, but because protocol demanded it. Any cadet who generated readings that exceeded expected thresholds was subject to full evaluation. He sat quietly while medbots ran the standard procedures. Blood drawn, reflexes tested, bone scans completed. Dr. Leskin, a veteran military physician with 40 years of combat trauma experience, reviewed the results in silence. "Your arm," she said, gesturing to the tablet, "should have dislocated from the torque of that impact." David raised his eyebrows. "But it didn't." "No," she said, "it didn't. Your shoulder capsule is dense. The ligaments reed is overdeveloped. The cortical bone density in your humerus is 50% above standard. That's not augmentation. That's natural." He shrugged with one shoulder. I played a lot of football growing up. She studied him. What about your joints? Any previous injuries? 2 minor fractures, left wrist, right ankle. 1 hairline, 1 clean break. Fully healed. She pulled up his file. Both injuries self-treated. No regenerative therapy, no correctional surgery. David gave a tight smile. Didn't have access. She looked up at him. Most of our cadets would still be in rehab. You're throwing spears hard enough to shatter war alloy. He said nothing. She tapped the screen again. You've got low-level micro-scarring in most of your connective tissues, especially near your spine and shoulders. Muscle adhesions, old strains. Your medical history is full of trauma markers, not life-threatening, but constant. Yeah, he said, that's normal where I'm from. Dr. Leskin set the tablet down. And for the first time in a very long career, she didn't know what to write in the summary, because all the injuries said he shouldn't be standing. But the evidence said he'd never stopped moving. The spear was returned to David 3 days later. Unaltered, untouched, rewrapped in the same cloth he'd brought it in. He accepted it with a nod. No ceremony, no recognition. But that day, when he walked through the central training halls, the jeers were gone. The whispers remained. And every eye followed him not with amusement, but with quiet calculation. Because now, no one laughed at the wood. Not anymore. The alloy pillar was repaired, or at least, it was reformed. The engineers replaced the fractured segment with a fresh slab, cast directly from the original source material Ankarian forge metal, a compound with internal lattice compression that resisted molecular disruption. The same alloy used in the hulls of Dreadnought-class warships and high-gravity armor suits. The technicians updated the control modules and added a new layer of reinforcement data to the AI observers embedded in the chamber walls. The message was clear. The last strike was anomaly. The real test would begin again. A second trial of strength was called, unprecedented, just weeks after the first. The announcement read, due to breach of expectations, a repeat of the ceremonial strike sequence is required. All cadets shall present weapons of certified design. No substitutions. All impacts will be logged under Imperial standards for force projection and material response. But everyone knew the truth. They were trying to prove that what happened before couldn't happen again. The training hall filled with renewed anticipation. This time, there was no laughter. Cadets sharpened their weapons under silent concentration. Even those who had mocked David the first time now took their trial more seriously. The weapons returned swords humming with stabilized plasma sheaths, axes lined with obsidian edge capacitors, glaives that used micrograv distortions to add momentum mid-swing. They all struck. Each made their mark. And each mark was shallow. Faint etchings. Scorched glances. One cadet, a 4-armed mammalian from Zark Prime, delivered a 2-handed hammer blow that made the alloy ring like a bell. The pillar flinched, but held. Data streamed across the overhead panels. Velocity, impact pressure, vibrational return. None surpassed the threshold David had set. And when his turn came again, the crowd shifted to give him space not from tradition, but from instinct. David approached calmly, holding the same spear. No modifications. The same fire-darkened shaft. The same carved grip. The instructors watched with less doubt now. More study, more unease. A tactical science officer in the viewing gallery whispered to her colleague, "Monitor the floor plate tension." Last time, the foundation shifted. David stood before the pillar. Still. Focused. He adjusted his stance slightly, a detail only a few noticed. Weight shifted differently this time. Then, without hesitation, he struck. The crack of impact was deeper now. Less thunder, more earthquake. The floor jumped. The overhead lights swayed. The alloy pillar groaned audibly. A new fracture appeared, not where the last one had been, but slightly higher, as though the first had weakened the base, and the second followed through. Monitors sparked with errors. AI feedback lines glitched mid-sentence. For a full 8 seconds, every digital display froze. Then rebooted. The crack was measured at 13 centimeters deep. And this time, a chip of the alloy broke off. Not a scratch. not a fracture. Material displacement. The hall didn't speak. No one breathed. David stepped back, setting the spear upright beside him. He looked at the instructors. "This one was harder," he said simply. Then he returned to his place in the line. The alloy chip was retrieved and sealed for analysis. The spear was scanned again twice, this time with molecular dissection and resonance mapping. The results were the same. Wood, unaugmented, no internal core. The only difference was that this time, the point had blackened slightly deeper from heat and stress. David's own biometrics showed elevated lactic acid levels and minor microtears in his left deltoid and pectoral. Nothing serious. A medic was called. "You shouldn't strike like that again," she said, inspecting his shoulder. "You're close to tissue rupture." He nodded. "I know, I'll rest it." She ran a musculoskeletal ultrasound. "You've got inflamed tendons. You'll need at least 10 days of reduced load. No overhead movement." He looked at her. "Can't get that in 4? Not unless you want permanent weakness in the joint." He sighed. "Tented Island." The medic added a note to his record. "Technically, you're benched for the duration of the endurance drills." "Figured," he said. She paused, studying his arm again. "You've trained with this kind of stress before?" "More than once." "No conditioning treatment? No supplements? No osteo-reinforcement?" "None." She stepped back. And for the first time, she looked at him the way others were beginning to. Not like an anomaly, but like a variable. The academy couldn't decide what to do with him. He wasn't in violation of any rules. His weapon was within regulations. His actions followed protocol. His health record showed he'd accepted treatment when advised. He hadn't hidden anything. He had just struck. And something had broken that wasn't supposed to. In a council meeting the next day, one of the senior trainers reviewed footage of the strike in slow motion. "I've seen super dense impacts. I've seen plasma surge compression hits. This isn't either." Another instructor, arms folded tight, asked, "Then what is it?" The science officer replied, without looking away from the screen. "It's intent." The footage was reviewed in silence again. Frame by frame. David's foot positioning, the grip of his left hand, the angle of his shoulder rotation, the acceleration of the thrust. Each movement registered with such practiced control that it didn't resemble power so much as inevitability. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, only function. But function shouldn't have been enough. Not against alloy forged to absorb kinetic blasts. Not against war metal. And certainly not from a man holding a wooden stick. A week after the second strike, the academy began receiving visitors. Not cadets, not officers. Observers. From planetary defense forces, naval engineering commands, and materials sciences divisions, they didn't speak to the cadets, they didn't wear insignia, but they watched, especially David. They stood on observation platforms during drills, silent behind polarized visors, recording every movement. They requested biometric overlays, slow-motion sparring footage, close-up analysis of tendon stress under high repetition. David knew they were there. He didn't acknowledge them. He still trained alone. His shoulder was healing slowly, the way it always did. Ice, rest, measured movement. The academy offered advanced repair treatments, but he declined anything beyond anti-inflammatories and topical regenerative gel. "I need it to heal right," he told the medics, "not fast." "Your range of motion will be limited for another week at least," one warned. "I can adjust," he replied. And he did. He shifted his drills to lower strikes, modified his shoulder angle, retrained his movements to accommodate pain without triggering further damage. The observers noted every change. Instructors stopped trying to guess what he was doing. They simply watched. The third test wasn't announced. It just happened. One morning, cadets arrived in the hall to find the alloy pillar replaced by something else. A sphere. Still made of Ankarian alloy, but cast as a perfect orb, suspended mid-air inside a gravitational anchor field. No base to brace against. No foundation to support an impact. The challenge wasn't just to strike it, it was to affect it at all. No one had ever even attempted it. Until now. The instructors made no speeches, no commands. They just turned and said, "Volunteers." No one moved. Then David stepped forward. No spear this time. Just himself. He approached the sphere, looked at it from all angles, reached out with one hand and tapped the surface. It gave no reaction. He stepped back. "Do I get one strike?" he asked. An instructor nodded. "Same as before." He rolled his shoulder gently, still sore, still not at full strength. Then he turned and walked away. Returned 5 minutes later, carrying a new spear. Similar to the first. Wood. Darkened from fire. The point was sharper, thinner. It gleamed faintly, not with alloy, but with oil. Treated. Hardened. He stood in front of the floating orb. Took a breath. Then lunged. The strike was faster than before. Shorter. More compact. His feet barely moved. His body didn't fully commit. Just one, clean, snapping movement. The sound was different this time. Not thunder. Resonance. The orb trembled in place. Not visibly, not to the eye. But the grav field shimmered. The sensors surrounding it flickered. A low hum echoed from inside the chamber walls. Then the orb moved. By less than a millimeter. But it moved. A red alert appeared on the monitor. Anchor field destabilized. The engineers froze. No weapon had ever registered enough force on an alloy float to trigger a gravitational feedback warning. And yet here it was, caused by a man with a wooden spear. The strike had transferred energy into a floating mass held in one of the most stable anchoring systems in galactic use. Not shattered. Disrupted. The instructors called the test off immediately. The orb was sealed and removed. David's spear was requested for study. Again. He handed it over without comment. The shaft was scanned. Same wood, same fire-hardened technique. The only addition? A precise tapering of the head for increased flexion at the moment of impact. A primitive version of what engineers called momentum snap, designed not to cut or puncture, but to transfer force. It wasn't an accident. It was design. The academy was no longer a place of laughter. Cadets passed each other with more guarded eyes. They sharpened their weapons less for show, more for function. The practice fields grew quiet, because a question now lived in the silence. If a wooden weapon, shaped by hand, could do this, what else were humans capable of? Instructors debated behind closed doors. Some argued for banning non-regulated weapons. Others suggested reclassifying human cadets under specialized training tracks. A few quietly asked whether they should be taught at all. But the highest-ranking official, Commander Talik, made a final ruling. "Let them train," she said, "and watch what they train with." When David walked through the mess hall the next evening, a cadet approached him. She was tall, crystalline-skinned, and carried a plasma glaive that had once won her top marks in weapon control. She didn't mock. She didn't ask to test his spear. She just said, "Can you show me how you think when you shape wood like that?" David looked at her a moment, then nodded. And they sat at a table, alone in a corner, with a napkin and a half-sharpened eating stick. He began explaining grain direction, tension, and how fire changed flexibility. Not in theory, but in feel. Word of the third strike traveled far beyond the academy. The footage leaked, no one admitted how, and within days it spread across every major military channel in the outer systems, not as official documentation, but as myth. A human cadet, bare-armed and undersized, wielding a wooden spear that struck alloy with such precision it destabilized a grav sphere. View counts soared. Analysis videos flooded forums. Engineers argued over whether the spear was secretly enhanced. Biomechanical specialists tried to recreate the strike digitally, but simulations couldn't replicate the result because they all assumed a weapon designed to break. They didn't understand yet. The spear hadn't been shaped to destroy. It had been shaped to survive contact. Back at the academy, the halls had changed. Cadets no longer polished their weapons for show. They trained in pairs now, studying kinetic transfer, reading the angles of approach, reviewing footage of their own form. Conversations shifted from volume of force to placement, from temperature yield to control. And always, somewhere in the back of those conversations, was David Carter. He didn't lecture. He didn't correct anyone. But one by one, cadets began drifting toward him, not to copy, but to learn, slowly, quietly, like students gathering around a fire they didn't understand, just to feel the heat. One night, after lights out, someone slid a note under his door. It read, "If that's what you do with wood, what happens when you forge metal?" He folded the note. Didn't respond. Because they didn't understand yet. It had never been about the material. It had always been about the hands. 3 days before graduation, the instructors called him in. Commander Talek waited inside the archive chamber, her tall frame silhouetted against a backdrop of etched armor designs and weapon schematics. She motioned for him to sit. On the table between them was the spear, cleaned, scanned, untouched. "You're being reassigned after graduation," she said. "Not infantry, not recon." David nodded. "You're being sent to the edge." His brow rose slightly. "Frontier Engineering and Survival Corps," she clarified. "We build from nothing, dead worlds, thin atmospheres, ruins. You'll be out there with fewer resources than this spear." David didn't blink. "That's familiar." She turned the spear slowly on the table. "There are people who still think you cheated." "I didn't." "I know," she said. "But that's not what they're afraid of." He tilted his head. "They're afraid that you didn't need to cheat." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "They've spent generations building weapons with enough energy to crack moons. And you walked in with a piece of earth, fire-treated, hand-carved, no alloys, and you broke the unbreakable." She paused. "So, tell me, honestly, what do you think made that spear work?" David looked down at the weapon, the grain in the wood, the line of the taper, the places where the soot hadn't fully rubbed out. Then he said, "Pressure, intent, practice, and patience." She waited. "It's not just a tool," he added. "It's the last thing you make when you've run out of everything else, when the cold is coming, when you're hungry, when there's one tree left and nothing else between you and whatever's out there." He looked up. "Humans don't make weapons to show off. We make them to keep going." Commander Talek nodded. "I wanted to hear you say it," she said. Then she pushed the spear toward him. "Take it." The lab didn't want to return it. "But I told them something I think you'll understand." David took the spear, fingers closing around it with the familiarity of memory. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "That it's not just a weapon." She stood. "It's a story." Graduation day arrived under a copper sky. The ceremony was short. Cadets called by name, banners displayed, final certifications distributed. There were no salutes. The academy believed in action, not performance. But when David's name was called, the hall was silent. No whisper, no mockery, no confusion. Just silence. And then after a long breath, the first 3 cadets he'd trained beside stepped forward. Not to speak. To stand with him. One held a ceremonial staff now notched with hand-shaped grip markers. Another carried a newly carved bow, its curve imperfect but strong. The third bore no weapon, just calloused hands. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, not in formation but in acknowledgement. No one else needed to say a word. That night, the alloy pillar was removed from the training hall. It had stood for 4 centuries. Now, it bore cracks from a spear that should never have mattered. But it did. Because for the first time, the trial wasn't about who struck hardest. It was about who understood what to strike for. David Carter left the next morning. No parade. No escort. Just a shuttle, a new uniform, and a transport case that held something not regulation. The spear. The same wood, same hands. No polish, no upgrades. And as the hatch sealed and the vessel lifted from the academy platform, one last whisper echoed through the gathered cadets. If that's what they do with wood, what happens when they pick up real weapons? No one answered. Because now, they understood. It wasn't about the weapon. It never had been. It was about the ones who shaped it, and what they chose to strike when it mattered most.